Housing discrimination is real and very much alive, but there are plenty of people out there trying to make sure that we do not get taken advantage of. Good morning and welcome to Maryland Today. My name is Jeff St. Pierre, and joining me today is one of those fine people. His name is Tom Simonton. He's the Director of Housing and Community Development at Guidewell Financial Solutions. Tom, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having us, Jeff.
So I understand that Guidewell Financial Solutions recently hosted a statewide fair housing training event. Before we discuss how fair housing affects all of us, why don't you tell us a little bit how things went?
Well, the event went great. This was actually Guidewell Financial's first stab at doing something like this. We wanted to open it up to the counselors all around the state. We were well pleased with the turnout. The event was kicked off by Secretary Holt from the Department of Housing and Community Development. We had over 50 attendees, and what was particularly impressive about this event was not only were there housing counselors, which is what this was geared to, there were also landlords that were interested in learning about fair housing. There were lenders that want to make sure that they're in compliance. There were real estate agents that want to make sure that they're properly marketing their products. So that was real special. Our sponsors were the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development, the Maryland Association of Realtors, and BB&T. And I'd just like to thank them publicly for their generous support.
Well, it sounds like the fair housing event was a huge success for you. So why did you decide to hold this anyway?
Well, primarily our housing counseling department has been caught up in the mortgage foreclosure crisis the past 8 years. We've actually counseled over 12,000 folks that were in distress with their mortgages. And a lot of these folks couldn't keep their homes. And they're out there. Some, fortunately, were able to re-enter the mortgage market. Some have to look for rental housing, but there's a lot of folks being taken advantage because of their precarious situation.
Sure. Well, we're going to try to help listeners today gain a better understanding of all this. So with that in mind, exactly what is the Federal Fair Housing Act?
Well, the Fair Housing Act is a law that protects buyers and renters from lender, seller, and landlord discrimination. The law protects certain classes of citizens by making it unlawful to treat them different from other buyers and renters. The act was originally signed into law in 1968 by Lyndon Johnson. This was after a really contentious debate in both the House and the Senate, and it was passed in the days just after Martin Luther King was assassinated. This was a follow-up bill to the landmark 1964 Civil Rights Bill, which was also signed shortly after the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, just a piece of Maryland history that goes along with the Fair Housing Act, that one of the biggest proponents, the person that pushed this bill through Congress, was Baltimore's own Clarence Mitchell Jr. He was a major force in getting it passed, and at the time, he was often referred to in the country as the nation's 101st senator.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. Well, exactly who is protected under this federal fair housing law?
Federal fair housing law prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, sex, disability, or familial status. Now, this last category safeguards families with children under the age of 18.
Okay.
State and local fair housing laws add protection to this. Maryland has been deemed in more than equal status to the federal law. So Maryland actually provides additional protections, including marital status, sexual orientation, and gender identity. It's important to understand that local counties can also add on to this law. They can't detract from it, but in particular, whatever county you live in may have its own addendums to this law.
Now, Tom, you might not know the answer to this, but is there any way to know which of these groups might be the most discriminated against?
Well, I did some research on this, and the data is really hard to gather. But what seems to be trending, particularly in the state of Maryland, is discrimination against folks with disabilities.
Okay. So what types of housing are included under the Federal Fair Housing Act?
The Fair Housing Act covers many different types of housing, including homes, apartments, and townhouses, which are for sale or for rent. There are some exemptions. For example, if I owned an apartment building with maybe 4 units in it, if I rented to all males, I could continue to rent to all males. I wouldn't be discriminating if I didn't rent to a female. If I rented only to people over age 62 with no children, I could do that. What I could not do is rent to a white male, but not a black male.
Okay.
It has to be consistent in what you're
Sure.
doing. So,
okay, that makes sense. So exactly what is prohibited under federal fair housing law?
the law says that lenders, real estate agents, property managers, and landlords can't treat members of a protected group differently from everyone else.
Okay.
For example, they can't refuse to rent or sell housing to them. An example of this is, let's say that we have a property manager sitting in the landlord's office, and African American family pulls up, they go into the rental office, and the rental office person says, "We don't have any units available." And, that could very well be possible. And the family leaves. A little bit later, maybe a white family pulls in, asks the same question. Is immediately an application offered, an apartment is shown, that type of thing. That's the more subtle form of housing discrimination that takes place. The same person or a real estate agent can't say that there isn't a house available, or a landlord can't say, "I don't have any apartments available," if in fact there are. You can't discriminate by making housing unavailable or deny a dwelling. This would be that if you went to an apartment complex and the landlord says, "Well, all my units that are empty are undergoing rehab, you'll have to come back," when in fact they may not be. So it's just, again, if you have an available apartment, you can't deny a person because of that. The big thing that goes on here is the different housing services or facilities to the person looking to rent a place. This would be like a family coming in that is directed to just the first floor of a building. Or if a person of color comes in, they can't be relegated to just a certain building or a certain floor. So you can't do something like that. You cannot deny anyone access to membership in a facility or service related to the sale or rental of housing. Those are some of the more under-the-radar type forms of discrimination that is prevalent today.
Sounds like there's a lot of things that housing professionals cannot do. But when it comes to saying no to buyers or renters, there has to be something that they can say no to. What are the criteria they have to, or they're allowed to use in that situation?
Well, there is, and this is what makes discrimination so pointless, because if a person is applying for an apartment and you don't want to rent to them, there are credit criteria. If a person doesn't have credit, if his credit is bad, in some instances, if there's a criminal history, in some instances, is a history of rental, not being a successful renter, not being able to pay your rent or your rent on time. It's just like when you go to apply for more, you fill out a credit application. You're essentially doing the same thing with a landlord. You're not entitled to an apartment just because you are.
We have all these safeguards in place to make sure that people are not discriminated against when they go to rent or purchase a house or an apartment. But once they become tenants, once someone becomes a tenant, what protections do they have at that point?
They still need to be monitoring what goes on. They need to be treated like everyone else. I've seen instances where some folks are charged a late fee after a week, other folks are not. And it all depends, if there's a pattern of what goes on. And people have to be diligent in what they're looking for. That's why it's very important before you go to rent a property, or even if you go to buy a home, that you understand what your rights and responsibilities are. Because there aren't any policemen out there that's going to say, well, okay, that's a housing discrimination violation. You have to be able to spot these. You have to be able to report these, document these things. And so it's very important that you learn these rights and responsibilities before you take occupancy, and to monitor them throughout your term of the lease.
So say you're a member of a protected group. What can you do to help safeguard yourself against housing discrimination?
Again, I go back, particularly like when you're buying a home, it's the largest purchase you're ever going to make. When you're renting an apartment, it's going to be your largest monthly expenditure over a period of a year. Educate yourself. We spend hours online comparing the price of a pair of shoes or something like that. But we walk into an apartment and plop down $1,100 security deposit, $1,100 a month. We don't check into it. We have no idea if this person is telling us the truth or not. And there's a lot of good things that have taken place, particularly in buying a home, that make the buyer more aware. But you have to educate yourself. It's just incumbent upon anyone entering into these types of arrangements to educate themselves.
So if you feel as though you've been discriminated against, is there anything you can do to help prove your case?
Well, there is. First of all, you must have clear evidence that you've been treated unfairly. Let's go back to my first example of the African-American couple being turned away and a white couple getting the apartment. It would be very responsible of them to maybe get a friend of theirs, another African-American couple, to go in and see if they get the same story. Then you document these things. I mean, everybody has a camera on their phone. You can videotape this. You can walk in. You can. Everybody does it. Those kinds of things. You just have to make sure that your accusation is well documented.
So why did Guidewell Financial decide to launch a rental counseling program this year?
Well, because one of the overriding issues in this country is safe, affordable, fair housing. particularly for folks in the low to moderate income range, people that have been impacted by the mortgage crisis, the recession itself, the loss of job, that type of thing. So we look at it as that we spend a lot of time and money building these programs around home buyer education. Well, there's an even bigger market, or bigger need, I should say, for rental counseling.
So how does rental counseling help clients become better informed?
Well, rental counseling takes from all the different types of counseling that Guidewell Financial offers its clients. It's a holistic approach to giving the clients what they need to understand their situation. When we do the home buyers education, we take great pains to help people understand the documents they're going to be signing, the documents that are going to be governing their life for the next 30 years. We do the same thing for renters. We look at mock leases that help them to understand what the terms are, what their obligations are, what their rights and responsibilities are under the terms of the lease.
I understand Guidewell Financial is also spearheading a special place-based initiative to help residents in Western Baltimore achieve housing goals and economic stability. How does this program work?
Well, this is a program that's really dear to my heart. I just think that this is a very impactful thing that Guidewell Financial Solutions has been able to do. We have a partnership with the University of Maryland in Baltimore. We provide them with a certified housing counselor, financial counselor there once a week, every Wednesday. At the Community Engagement Center, that's located at 1 North Poppleton. Our counseling is free to the clients, to the local residents. And even if you're not a resident of the Poppleton neighborhood, if you want to talk to a financial counselor or a housing counselor, come down and visit with us. We're more than glad to help you. Approximately 75% of the people that we see at the center come in for rental counseling. These are folks that the average household income for this area is $30,000. And their rents often exceed 60% of their take-home income, and a lot of that is, Social Security, et cetera. So these people have real challenges trying to meet their rent, and we're there to help them understand how their money works, how they can make it work better for themselves, so that rent is not an issue every month.
Well, it sounds like you guys are doing a lot of great work over there, as always. Before we do close things up here, Tom, do you have any parting advice for listeners interested in fair housing?
Well, like anything, I guess I've found in my 63 years, knowledge is power. Mm-hmm. It's time to learn about your rights. That's what we have them for. It's necessary to know them and understand them. And I also think the flip side of that is to understand what your responsibilities are as well. You can contact Guidewell Financial. We have a 50-year track record helping local residents become more financially informed. To set up an appointment, call us at 1-866-731-8486, or come visit our website or our Community Engagement Center at 1 North Poppleton.
And that website is guidewellfs.org if you're interested. Tom Simonton, the Director of Housing and Community Development at Guidewell Financial Solutions. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming by here today and educating us more about this.
Again, thanks for having us.